Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome to the Guilty as Charged podcast. My name is Steven and I am the host. Joining me tonight and every night is my good friend Tyler. Tyler, what's up, man? How you doing tonight?
Doing very well. It's a bit rainy here in California, which is very nice. I love it. A little bit of rain. Not fun when you're trying to do intramural soccer and ref any of that, but hey, all good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. We were messaging back and forth about this, so we talked about it on Tuesday, obviously. What an opening to Daredevil, man. We're not going to give any spoilers, but when I heard that Disney was bringing Daredevil back, I was very nervous about it. And, you know, the early returns on his appearances and Kingpin's appearances have not been great. But man, did they absolutely nail the first two episodes, in my opinion. So had to talk about it briefly, but Daredevil is back. There's weirdly like a lot of shows out right now that I've been watching. And so this is a great time for shows, and very happy with the early returns from Daredevil.
Yeah, very relieved. At minimum, I am very relieved that it turned out well so far. Surprised by the beginning, good beginning. I'll see how the rest of it goes.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so while you guys are trickling in here, I guess we'll just kind of break it down. So today's show, we're going to put a bow on our free agency coverage, our pre-free agency coverage, I should say. We're going to be live every day next week as needed while the Chargers are making moves and things like that. So we are hopefully going to be with you guys every day next week. We would love to see it because this team making moves is always a great time. We've had some live signings previously. The track record of those live signings have not been great. We were on this show when the JC Jackson news broke, and that didn't turn out. But the vibes of that show were fantastic, and it was a great time. We had an awesome show that night. Arjun was on. Alex Insdorf was on. You and I were on. So free agency shows are a blast, and hopefully you guys will tune in for that. So tonight, we're going to put a bow on that, on the pre-free agency stuff, and then next week we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what exactly the Chargers are doing. But of course, we do have to start with the Chargers' decision to release Joey Bosa. We've talked a lot about this. That $36 million cap hit was unfortunately just not a tenable situation for them. They released him and saved $25 million in cap space. So they are working with close to $90 million in cap space ahead of next week, ahead of the Khalil Mack decision and things like that. So business-wise, it makes a lot of sense. But what are your thoughts about Joey Bosa moving on? What this means for the team, in the short term and the long term, and I guess if we want to hash out Joey Bosa's legacy, we can do that. But yeah. What are your thoughts? Outside of the business decision, which makes a lot of sense. What are your thoughts about Joey Bosa moving on?
I was at the Chargers season ticket event in San Diego at SeaWorld when they held that draft class, that showing, and that was awesome. I loved that event. And of course, there was plenty of different names thrown around, a lot of Ezekiel Elliott, a lot of Jalen Ramsey, this or that. And I think
Ronnie Stanley was like the betting favorite heading into that.
Yeah, 100%. They were taking everybody really but Joey Bosa. Mm-hmm. And when they announced Joey Bosa, I have a recording of it somewhere. You hear a lot of people going, "What?" Like, huh? And I was surprised. At the time, I was not following the Chargers as much. Maybe I would have predicted it these days. That was more of a casual, like, okay, cool, the draft is this and that. And after the contract negotiation snafu, that was the start to his career.
What a different time.
What a totally different time, right? Absolutely different time. He walked onto the field and I think it had 2 or 2.5 sacks against Derek Carr. And for a stretch there, I couldn't think of any better player the Chargers have had. And it felt like the Chargers were going to get the best defensive player they had ever had. This was someone who could break all the Chargers' individual records and be one of the best players. Obviously, he won Defensive Rookie of the Year. And you felt like you could see just the future with him and then Melvin Ingram. And at his best, which is why we've defended him, why the Chargers hung on to him last year. At his best, there were a few that were better. Joey Bosa, at his best, let's say against the Bills, twice, for whatever reason, just hated the Buffalo Bills. At his best, he was one of the best as a run defender and as a pass rusher, which is so rare. I mean, you even look at some of the guys in free agency other than Khalil Mack this year. There are guys who we talked about as designated pass rushers, but none of them are really great run defenders. And Joey Bosa was arguably at his best a better run defender than pass rusher, which is saying something because he was one of the best per play guys as a pass rusher. It really just came down to, unfortunately, the string of concussions and significant injuries that kept him off the field. That is truly a bummer and really put a lid or put a ceiling and capped what could have been one of the greatest Chargers defensive legacies. So he is, of the last decade, sure, definitely one of the best Chargers players, at least on defense, but there could have been so much more. So it was rough at the end of his career there with the Chargers. A lot of fan backlash with that contract. Comes a lot of expectations, and he was not able to meet those expectations. But I will always appreciate how hard he fought to get onto the field. I don't think people really gave him enough credit for how much he had to fight through, both mentally and physically, and he's discussed both. And I truly wish him all the best, because even though it did not turn out awesome in the end, the last couple of years, he really did give it his all. And I'm going to miss seeing him out there because, again, it's he's technically right now the last San Diego Charger on the roster, and we've watched him since 2016.
Yeah,
I talk a lot about what it's been 10 years since this, or back when we were in high school, this or that, or so many years ago. What were you doing in 2016? What were you guys in the chat doing in 2016? It's been a long time watching Joey Bosa. So I am truly going to miss him, and I hope he finds more success somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, his legacy is a tricky one. Calvin pointing out the contract makes it difficult to really talk about, how he'll be remembered. But I think ultimately, when we look back on the Joey Bosa, selection and what he meant to the team, I think, we as a collective fan base will remember him a little bit more fondly than right now. I think there's a lot of people who are conflicted right now, a lot of people who are like good riddance, and I guess I can kind of understand that, but to me, this is a guy who, he finished second all time in franchise sacks, second, and he has really like hardly played the last 3 years. So this is a guy who, at his best, was one of the best defensive players that we have seen in Chargers history, and going back to his his rookie contract days. He started his rookie season late, like you mentioned, and he still put up 59 pressures, 11 sacks, 11 quarterback hits. He followed that up in 2017 with 75 pressures, 13 sacks, 11 hits. And then 2018, unfortunately, he was banged up. Came back strong in 2019, 72 pressures, 12 sacks, 17 hits. And at that point in time, we can look back on the contract as a miss or whatever have you, but 3 of his first 4 seasons, he was truly one of the best edge rushers in the league, like easily top 5. And that reputation carried some weight. He got top 10 votes in Jeremy Fowler's poll this past season. Like his reputation was very well respected around the league and very well deserved because of what he did early on. And then, obviously 2020 was a bit of an up and down season with injuries there, but he still finished with 61 pressures, 8 sacks. 22 quarterback hits that year. 22. Crazy. And then 2021, the season when, I think that's when he had his best run defense season, was 69 total pressures, 10 sacks, 9 hits. This is a guy, again, like the Chargers did not get a proper return of investment on that contract, but he absolutely deserved every single bit of that contract because he was putting out top 5 edge rusher numbers basically every season for the first portion of his career. Now, unfortunately, the past 3 seasons have not gone great. He barely crossed 1,000 total snaps in the 3 seasons during the playoff game. So Khalil Mack in his first season put up over 900 snaps, in his second season over 900 snaps. This year they kind of tapered him back a little bit, but 1,000 snaps over the last 3 seasons is unfortunately the reason why people feel the way that they do about Joey Bosa right now. And again, I get the frustration, I get the return of investment, but this guy, when he was at his best, was a true pleasure to watch, and he terrorized opposing quarterbacks. And it's going to be really strange not having him on the team. And there's been obviously this gradual transition from the players of our childhood and early adulthood, right? And Joey was kind of the last one. You know, Keenan's gone, Mike's gone, Austin Eckler's gone, Melvin Gordon, Phillip Rivers, everybody, you know, from that group is unfortunately not on the team. So it's going to be weird, man, not to see Joey Bosa out there, and we'll see what happens from the rest of the team perspective. But I'm going to miss watching Joey Bosa on the Chargers. I loved watching him when he was on the field. Even this year when he was very clearly not healthy, he put up an 8 pressure game against the Bengals. Like, he had some great moments. His playoff game this year was really, really good. So it sucks. You know, the 9 years was definitely a roller coaster, but you know, I think I will remember the positive moments at a higher level as opposed to some other people. And, you know, I get why others would not feel that way.
Yeah, I will. Now that it's quote unquote over, I know there was a report that maybe they could come back, and I don't think the Chargers do all that they did.
Yeah, that was a little exaggerated on Twitter. Like, Ian Rappaport like kind of threw it in at the end of his little bit. He was like, yeah, theoretically they could bring him back, but it seems like he's going elsewhere. Yeah. And then people were like, oh, the door's open. And that's not really what he said, folks, if you watch the clip.
Yeah. So wish him all the best. Just wrapping up, like, the last thing, I suppose, and I guess it's fitting considering we had to do this a few times the last few years. When it comes specifically to his character, I do not want to hear any particular slander. Yeah. As far as I'm aware, if you align with his views differently, you know, that's your thing, and that's a whole different thing. But I had never heard a single bad thing about Joey. And frankly, I think the easiest way to point to the fact that Joey is a pretty high character stand-up guy, at least for the Chargers and on the team, easiest way to point that and prove to that is Khalil Mack gave him the time of day, and Khalil Mack was great friends with him and spent so much time with him and working with him. I don't think Khalil Mack just does that. So I am definitely going to miss Joey Bosa out there.
Yeah, I've ranted about the character stuff for a long time. His teammates love him. You know, his coaches, everybody that has been around him loves him, and so I will always push back against the Joey character things. You know, there's always been the assumption that he, you know, shares the same viewpoints as his brother, but his brother is like actively portraying it during a NFL broadcast, and Joey never did that. So, you know, you can say whatever you want about him, but his teammates loved him, his coaches loved him, his front office executives loved him. He took a pay cut to stay on the team. He pushed through injuries time and time again. And yeah, it sucks that the injuries were that frequent, but he did not have to come back in 2022 after tearing his groin, and he pushed and pushed and pushed. He did not have to try and come back from his foot injury, and he did it. He did not have to come back as early from the back/hip injury this year, and he did it. He played through a tremendous amount of pain for this team. And so whatever you think about, did he live up to his contract, whatever, I think we have to respect the amount of effort and energy and pain that this guy played through. So, you know, I will always remember Joey Bosa fondly, and I get it. And people will talk about his contract and his draft pick solution. We all remember Sean Merriman extremely fondly at this point in time. And he played like 3 great seasons for the Chargers, and that was about it. So, you know, we all talk to this day. Everybody references the Jason Verrett 1 season. You know, so right now, some of you guys might feel a certain way, but down the road, I think we're all going to look back at Joey Bosa and think very fondly of him.
Yeah, kind of wrap it up here with Ryan Parsons super chat. We'll miss Joey a ton, even though it was the right move. Was one of the most exciting Chargers of the last decade. Sucks feeling like we still never got to see the best of his potential.
Yeah, I do agree with that. Yeah, as Brendan points out, Joey just talked about anime half the time. Like, the dude was on the sidelines talking about anime, and you know, that's all he wanted to do with his friends on the football team was talk about anime. So yeah, we'll see where he ends up. It kind of seems like the 49ers are etched in stone. They do have his brother, obviously. They have Gus Bradley as well, who he's very familiar with and loves. So it seems like that's the early betting favorite right now.
Yeah, and I think we'll get into more so the draft. I feel like you and I are headed that direction when it comes to edge, but Jacob points out, like, edge is definitely a huge need. Question is, how much do you believe in Thule?
Yeah, I agree there. Okay, now we are going to pivot to our non-negotiables from a 2025 free agency standpoint. We do this show every single year. I think it's a great way for us to kind of frame what needs to happen over the next couple of weeks for the Chargers. And there's a lot of talk online about going all in signing or trading for big players, and obviously the DK Metcalf stuff happened after our show on Tuesday. There's Trey Hendrickson is available. There's a lot of big names that could be had on the trade market right now. But at the same time, the Chargers have a ton of needs. They have like 26 open roster spots that they have to fill, including a lot of starters. And so the free agency non-negotiables, I think, is a good way for us to kind of put a bow on our pre-free agency coverage and kind of lay the groundwork for what is going to ideally happen over the next week or so.
Yes. And while generally Steven and I do agree, the ones we're going to talk about aren't necessarily like all 7 don't need to happen. We just threw out the non-negotiables that we felt were more important.
Yeah, I agree there. Okay, first and foremost, the non-negotiable number one for this specific team, I think, is that this team has to come away from free agency with 2 starting caliber interior offensive linemen. Now, obviously, there's a lot of talk about Zion Johnson potentially playing center. There's a lot of talk about the center class and everything like that. So I think the Chargers' approach should be to sign 2 players who can start at a variety of positions, potentially gives them a lot of flexibility. But this to me is the most important non-negotiable to start, because this is how this team wants to play football. They have already talked about being an offensive line organization. They have talked about the tip of the spear. They've talked about viewing offensive linemen as weapons. This is where they now get to go put their money where their mouth is, essentially. The Rashawn Slater extension is also part of this. But you look at the overall season in 2024, the Chargers, in their wins, their Chargers allowed a pressure percentage of 31%, which is very, very good. That is a good number. Ideally, a high in offensive line will carry around 28 to 30%. So being at 31% with last year's group in wins is great. In losses, however, and that includes the playoffs, that rate dropped to or increased to 39%. So it's a very simple candidate for me there. And then they finished 27th in rushing success rate as well. So, you guys listen to the national media talk about the Chargers, and they were always like the run game, the Jim Harbaugh, Greg Roman, they love to run the football. They really were not a highly effective run game. It was really J.K. Dobbins had some explosive moments, and Justin Herbert added some value with his legs. But we didn't really get to see them truly establish their identity because of the interior offensive line. And I think it is time for them to go out and aggressively fix that issue.
I think at minimum, even if we just pare this down to upgrade the interior offensive line, whether it's 1, 2 guys and another backup, whatever, this is, as you said, the most important thing they have to do for all the reasons that you mentioned, to find their identity. And because this draft class isn't great, Steven's watched more interior offensive linemen than I have, so I can't say definitively, but it sounds like through most accounts, this is not a great class if you're desperate for interior offensive linemen. And the Chargers potentially need at least 2 and potentially 3, depending how they feel about Zion Johnson heading into his final year of his rookie contract. So, yeah, I think this has to get solved. I would be stunned if there's not at least one, not high paid, because there are not even many high paid options left with Trey Smith playing. Well,
there's rumors that Aaron Banks is going to get like $18 million in free agency, man.
All right, so there's very few options that also make sense at their current projected price. There's no Trey Smith contract, at least, but Aaron Banks at $18 million would be something else. And hey, best of luck to him. But I would be surprised if they didn't get one of these spots short up in free agency. And frankly, 2 sounds good to me.
Yeah, two is definitely where I'm at. I think they can very realistically hit 2. Now, they're not going to get 2 of the top ones. Like, you're not going to get Will Fries and Aaron Banks. Like, you're probably going to get one of those players and then one of the other players on this list. So this group that I have on here for our audio audience does include Will Fries from the Colts, Tevin Jenkins from the Bears, Patrick McCarry from the Ravens, Aaron Banks from the 49ers, Kevin Zeitler from the Lions, Ryan Kelly from the Colts, James Daniels from the Steelers, Ben Bredesen from the Buccaneers, Will Hernandez from the Cardinals, and Laken Tomlinson from the Seahawks. So this is essentially like, PFF has their free agent list up to 150, and this is essentially every group, in every player in that group. But it is kind of separated out by tiers here. It sounds like Will Fries and Aaron Banks are going to get a huge payday. Those are kind of the two top guys now. That Trey Smith has been franchise tagged, and so those two guys are at the top of the market. Tevin Jenkins and Patrick McCarry and Ryan Kelly are kind of under that, along with Kevin Zeitler. And then there's, some solid mid-tier free agents in James Daniels, who is coming off an Achilles tear, but by all accounts, apparently has been recovering well. And then Ben Bredesen, Will Hernandez, Laken Tomlinson. So you can pick and choose here, I think, depending on how you want to spend this $90 million. But to me, the absolute worst case scenario here from a higher end standpoint needs to be Patrick McCarry. Patrick McCarry should be, of the four potential guards that could be relatively expensive. That's the worst case scenario here. So one of those guys, Fries, Jenkins, McCarry, or Banks, I think should be a Charger come next week.
Yeah, I think at minimum, you have to head into the draft with Zion. I'm going to say it, but Bradley Bozeman and a starting truly good option at right guard, or unless Zion's your right guard and whatever, but you have to upgrade a guard spot at minimum heading into this draft class. And that's very much so at minimum. I know it's a non-negotiable, so there should be no negotiations here. I agree. It should be 2 starting caliber interior offensive linemen, but it's not my money.
It is not my money, but I think, again, from a cultural standpoint, this team wants to be able to be an offensive line organization. If they're serious about that, then 2 of these guys have to be on this team, in my opinion. So, I pointed this out on Twitter today. Ben Bredesen, who I know his PFF grades are not great, but if you listen to Brandon Thorne talk about him, if you listen to Robert Mays, if you listen to Mike Golick Jr., if you listen to Jeff Schwartz, these guys all agree that Ben Bredesen was really, really good for the Buccaneers this last year. Again, the grades are really subjective, and it's really, tough sometimes to quantify what it can look like from an offensive line perspective. I'm not going to sit here and pretend to watch a ton of Buccaneers tape, but man, did he look good against the Chargers. I can say that for sure. Yeah. And he played for Jim at Michigan. He was drafted by the Ravens. He played for the Giants when Andy Bischoff was there. He can play left guard, center, and right guard. And so if you're the Chargers, Ben Bredesen can't be your headliner, but he makes a lot of sense as you potentially head into the draft, where you were just talking about, their options at center. So you bring in an expensive right guard, Fries, Jenkins, or Banks or McCarry, and then you sign Ben Bredesen, you bring back Bradley Bozeman, you draft a Tate Ratledge, for example, and you have your right guard set, and then you duke it out in training camp, and whoever comes out on top from that group at left guard and center, you roll with it. And I think that's an adequate investment, in my opinion, in improving the offensive line.
Yeah. And I do hope there is that competition this year that was not present this past season, but I think with more options, they will more naturally go with that competition. And then these are the guys that they brought in, rather than just Trey has to work potentially because of the contract. If they bring in certain guys, they're going to want them to compete and get the best out of them.
Yeah. So we'll see what happens. If they wanted to just remake the 2021 Ravens offensive line and bring McCarry and bring Kevin Zeitler in, I'm not opposed to that. That's not a long-term solution with Kevin Zeitler, obviously, but still very, very good for the Chargers' potential here.
Yes.
Okay. Next one here is reclamation projects. Why don't you take this one, Tyler?
Yeah. So this one's a little bit different. Last slide, we talked about more expensive options potentially. To me, this is more your potentially very low signing options, but look, Jesse Minter last year, and I think I'm mostly talking about defense here because I believe in Jesse Minter, and I didn't see this a whole lot on offense last year, but Minter changed the way I completely view what coaching means and what a defensive coordinator and his staff can do for the defense. We'd been so conditioned to feel a certain way about backup players or new players or cast off players or whatever you want with the previous regime. Sure, like occasionally you get like a couple game wonder with the previous regimes, but Minter made it work with everybody, and they, for the most part, all played far above expectation. And so I think this year they need to continue to do that and find maybe their next Elijah Molden, Christian Fulton, even though it didn't work out well post-injury. That signing and how he played before injury, he was awesome and like far, far exceeded his own value in terms of the contract. Tart, I think more so than Ford. Tart, a bit of a reclamation project, cut by several teams. Can you imagine the defense without him last year? I can't. He was a great part of it. So this year, whether it's a Caleb Farley, who's currently with or was with the Panthers, former Titans player, while Minter was at Vanderbilt, seems to be the lucky year there. And we talked about Eric Stokes, plenty of these players. I want them to continue, even if some of them turn out like Alex Leatherwood. Some of them can also be your Elijah Molden or your Tart or your Fulton. Again, I feel more strongly that the defense will figure it out, that Minter can figure it out with these guys, but keep mining those players, especially because you have plenty of cap space to make it work too. So yes, go sign an expensive interior offensive line, but go find some of these other guys too who just need that second chance. Whoever it ends up being, especially if it's in the secondary, I feel confident betting on any of them to be better than they were at the previous stop because I believe in Minter that much.
Yeah, I think if you look at some of these recent teams who have made strong Super Bowl runs, a lot of them get a really high impact signing from a reclamation project. I mean, look what the Eagles got out of Zach Bond this year. That's kind of like the main staple right here. They paid him, I think it was like $2 million, and then they just handed him 17.5 this past week. Not to say that these guys are going to be that kind of player, but I think betting on high-end traits, as long as you have like the Chargers were not afraid to do like reclamation projects. They just would like hand them starting roles under Tom Telesco. As long as you're not making Caleb Farley your starting corner, like I don't think we're asking for that. But can he come in and potentially challenge Dean Leonard for your corner 4 spot? Like I think that's kind of what we're talking about here. So some other candidates here. Caleb Farley is obviously the one that's on the screen. But Eric Stokes from the Green Bay Packers, I think we mentioned on a previous show. Peyton Turner from the Saints, I think would be interesting. Never really hit his floor there. I had a hard time finding offensive ones, and again, like we're mostly talking about Jesse Minter here. But I wanted to throw in Kyle Pitts here just because it's not really worked out in Atlanta, and I know like fans who play fantasy and picked him probably feel a certain way. But he had 1,000 yards as a rookie, and he's shown some real flashes. He's dealt with some injuries. It's not really a fit for what the Falcons want to do. So I think the Chargers should aim higher at tight end. But if they wanted to just take a dart throw and trade, a 5th round pick or whatever for Kyle Pitts, I wouldn't hate that.
Yeah, neither would I. So open to anything. Again, these don't have to be big, giant, needle moving. They're not going to change the entire fortune of the Chargers this season, I don't think. But if you hit on at least one of them, it could make a difference.
Yeah. Other players here, Rondell Moore from the Falcons, previously drafted very highly from the Cardinals. Richie Grant, also of the Falcons. That's an interesting one to me. Former 2nd round pick. I loved him coming out of the draft. Did not work out in Atlanta. And then Jackson Carman of the Dolphins, previously of the Bengals. Chargers obviously need offensive line help. That would be more of kind of your Alex Leatherwood signing, where he's your 10th offensive lineman in training camp, and you see what happens. And then I put Tommy Tremble from the Panthers as well. We know the Panthers connection was real, which is so funny to me looking back. But and Notre Dame connection obviously as well. Good call there. He's more of a blocking tight end at this point, but he was a really, really good athlete as well. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, I missed the Evan Ingram release on there.
Yeah, the new GM in Tampa Bay took he cut that Trent Baalke roster down, man. He cut all of his free agents.
Yeah, no kidding. Jimmy, this is weird. A reclamation project as a non-negotiable. Yes, continue to take swings on buy low players. That's generally what I'm getting at here.
Yeah, great teams do this all the time. It is what it is. I think the smart teams make a killing on return of investment, right? And we know what Joe Ortiz feels about a compensatory pick formula. So if the Chargers signed an Eric Stokes and he had to start for them and looks great, or Caleb Farley, same kind of thing, you just know that they're going to go get a compensatory pick. So I think this is the right way to frame this.
Yeah, and it's not even like a new thing for them. To me, this is just to keep doing what you were doing.
Yeah,
because I think it paid off last year.
Yeah, there's going to be a balance of pay expensive players and
yes,
bring back some other value pieces as well. They can't just stop doing that. Like they
Right.
hit so many value pieces. I mean, we could classify Poona Ford as a reclamation project if we're being honest here. So, I mean, that guy was benched and cut from the Bills. So that's the kind of stuff that we could also talk about. But I think this list is kind of more geared towards like former high draft pick who didn't really work out.
Right.
Okay, next one here. We are going to talk about wide receivers. I think it truly is a non-negotiable that this team has to sign a vertical starting wide receiver, and I'm placing an emphasis on the vertical. I understand that there are other wide receivers out there. I understand that there are pieces that people might like, but vertical is the emphasis here because of who the team has and because of the way that Justin Herbert can play football and the way that Greg Roman wants to call games with Justin Herbert. So obviously you have Joshua Palmer, who apparently might get like a decent kind of pay raise in free agency right now. There's a decent amount of buzz for him. But Joshua Palmer, DJ Chark, and Simi Foko are all free agents. Those were their three main vertical options from last season, if you will. We had some brief moments from Simi, some brief moments from Palmer. Didn't really get much from DJ Chark. So essentially, the Chargers need to get a legitimate vertical option to essentially upgrade from the three of them into one legitimate player. So the Chargers need to do this because Ladd McConkey is their intermediate threat. He can push vertically, obviously, but he made a killing last year on all of the, like 8 to 15 yard routes. And that's where you want Ladd to live. Quentin Johnson, his best routes are the short routes. You have your slants, your drags, your crossers, everything like that. So you need somebody who can vertically open up space for this group. And that's really what I am talking about. So there are other people like Keenan Allen, who I'm not going to bring up here because that doesn't solve that issue. The major issue with the Chargers wide receiver room is they don't have anybody who can truly take the top off of defenses, whether that's jump balls on the sideline, whether that's being a speed threat. That's the group that the Chargers need to focus on. And there are some potential targets listed below.
I wouldn't mind even if they got one of the higher price guys if they also went and found themselves another guy to add to this group. Not as strongly as interior offensive line, which genuinely does need potentially three new bodies in there. But if they go get, I don't know, let's say it is Amari Cooper they end up with. I'm not saying that's my favorite. Let's say they get Amari Cooper. Please, by all means, go get another receiver to add to this room too.
I was just responding to Thomas Martinez, who made a great point about reclamation projects, that if the Chargers are continually successful with those revivals, their reputation for it will help attract free agents in the future. The Eagles are, like, we keep talking about them, but what they just did with Mekhi Becton, it goes a really long way to get guys into that room. And so if the Chargers can do that, that's a great point. So fantastic.
Yeah.
From Thomas there.
Yeah. I mean, if Poona Ford gets a great deal, Elijah Molden obviously just got a deal. And that's the other thing. It's not even just that the Chargers had great success with these guys and kicked them out. Like Elijah Molden was rewarded for this by the team. So I completely agree with Thomas's point there.
Yeah. So a little bit of an underrated point here that I forgot to bring up just a bit ago. Justin Herbert had the third highest average depth of target in the league last year. So we all for years have been begging the Chargers to push the ball downfield, and they finally did it last year. Now they need to go get him the pieces to properly do that. So Devontae Adams listed here, DK Metcalf, Amari Cooper, Darius Slayton, who we touched on a little bit last episode. I did put Deontay Johnson just because the Chargers expressed interest in him last year twice. Actually, I think 3 different times. Mike Williams, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, again, who they brought in for a visit last year, and then he signed with the
Mm.
Bills and then was cut and signed with the Saints. His numbers were still very, very good last year for the Saints. Nick Westbrook-Akine from the Titans, and then Matt Collins from the Bills, who I've talked about a lot. But one of these guys, preferably one of the more legitimate options, will be a Charger next week for me.
Yeah, no, I completely agree there. I mentioned on Twitter yesterday, I think, here's their list of receivers I'm interested in, all of them. And I don't really mean that, but I kind of mean that because, look, even if they don't, because they can't, for whatever reason, get a wide receiver one, they can't, let's say it's Adams and Metcalf are your wide receiver ones, and someone else pays more, or they don't trade Metcalf, or someone else pays more because they traded for more, whatever. You can find upgrades for wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 4. This group just needs help. Again, I was at the Houston game and I watched all of that happen in front of me. And so to me, everyone's kind of just doing this, and we'll talk about tight ends in a second. Everyone's kind of doing this, that player's that, and this player's that, and he's got this, and he's got that. They just need plenty of help in this receiving core. And if it's a high price guy, great. If it's a mid-tier guy, great. If it's the last guy to make the receiver room, but it's Mac Hollins and he's blocking his ass off and can give you like that supercharged Simi Fehoko for you as a receiver who has 400, 500 yards, was successful with the Raiders, for God's sake. Like, that's great for your room.
Yeah, it is great for your room. And I'm a big Mac Hollins fan. Just the idea of getting somebody that physical, that fast, I think makes a lot of sense. He's not a great wide receiver, although he was kind of the Bills wide receiver too in the playoffs. So we'll see what happens there. But we talked a lot about Davante Adams on our previous show. Obviously, I think we are very much on board with that conversation. But now that DK Metcalf has officially requested a trade, we haven't talked a ton about this. We haven't really fleshed this out.
Mm-hmm.
The Seahawks are reportedly asking for a first-round pick and a third-round pick for a trade in return for DK Metcalf. Now, there's a very big difference of like, hey, we're going to put this out there that this is the asking price versus what the trade will actually be.
Mm-hmm.
I think it settles in kind of a second and like you swap a fourth and a sixth kind of deal.
Sure.
But then you also have to consider an extension for DK Metcalf, which is probably a $30 million range kind of contract extension. So where are you at with DK Metcalf? Would he be ahead of Davante Adams for you, or where would he kind of settle in terms of preference of acquisition, knowing what we know about how much it will cost to get him?
Right. So going back to your previous point, Chargers need help. Would DK Metcalf help the Chargers? Absolutely. So would I be in favor of it? Sure. Is he my number one preference? No. To me, that would be Davante Adams for a few reasons. One being like we already talked about Davante Adams. The numbers are great. The floor is there. It makes sense as a boundary guy. He can separate. He succeeded with God knows what at quarterback the last few years. So Davante Adams would still be number one for me over DK Metcalf. And I believe, especially because it would have been free agency, if T. Higgins were available in free agency, he would have been also ahead of DK Metcalf for me. Yeah. But still, I am very much so in favor of the Chargers bringing in DK Metcalf. TBD, depending on how much they're officially going to get, or the Seahawks would get for trading him. But for the most part, as long as things are generally as expected with the compensation, I would be for it. Just not as my first option, but I'm very happy with that selection or that option.
Yeah, we're on the same page there. Adams still is my top option. Heck, he doesn't even cost you a compensatory pick because he was cut. Right. So that to me just makes so much sense, and we'll see what his priorities are. DK Metcalf, I think, still would be comfortably number 2 on that list, just because Amari Cooper has a lot of questions. Last year in Buffalo and Cleveland was not super pretty, although I think for the Chargers he would still have some value as an X and can obviously come down with contested catch situations. The question for DK is what exactly is this going to cost? So there's a lot of people out there that were like, oh, you just trade a 3rd round pick and Quentin Johnson for him. It's not happening that way. Part of trading for DK Metcalf is that he is on an expiring contract, and so that actually increases his value as opposed to somebody who is on a more expensive contract. So Devontae got traded to the Jets for a 3rd-round pick, and last year Stephon Diggs got traded to the Texans for an equivalent of a 3rd-round pick. And those two guys were on expensive contracts. They were older. They're not, in their physical prime like DK Metcalf is. And yes, you have to give him a contract extension, but being on an expiring contract, it's very workable to bring him into the cap. You extend him, you lower your cap hit. Financially, it's pretty easy to acquire him. So that plus his age, plus this not being a great free agency group, not being a great draft class, I think worst case scenario is DK Metcalf is a 2nd-round pick and something else. So you're giving up pick 54 for DK and something else. For other teams, I would probably be a little bit hesitant, but for the Chargers, they have the guy who knows how he works. They have Sanjay Lal, who got his best seasons in Seattle. I think for the Chargers, he could be worth that. But I just have such a hard time envisioning this specific team trading a top 60 pick and paying $30 million to a wide receiver. Maybe that's just a little short-sighted because we've only had one offseason, but it just doesn't feel like that makes as much sense financially, roster-wise, as a Devontae Adams does, who will be cheaper, doesn't cost you any draft picks, doesn't cost you a compensatory pick. So I am in favor of it, but I have a hard time seeing this specific regime actually going through and trading for DK Metcalf.
Yeah, I think I do believe they would invest in Devontae Adams in that contract because of all the reasons we mentioned, the comp pick formula, etc. But I do feel like, kind of as Dylan is pointing out here, their next move, I think, would be to find a mid-tier free agent and then work through the draft. That just feels like the play to me. Devontae Adams, I do think, is worth the investment to them, and I think they would feel the same way. DK, I don't see that being a Harbaugh-Ortiz move.
Yeah. But that's a great point. That you could sign a Darius Slayton as your speed threat, go get your X in the 2nd round, and I think the Chargers would feel very comfortable that they would have made some strides at the wide receiver room that way, and I think they would be justified in that regard. So
yeah,
Darius Slayton, we'll see what the paycheck is. Tutu Atwell just got $10 million today, so I don't know, man. Like PFF projects him at like 12.5. I think that might be closer to like 15, 16, 17. That's a little dicey. I don't know, but I do like Darius Slayton. I do think there are connections there, obviously, with Andy Bischoff. And I do think it makes some sense. So we'll see what happens. But Darius Slayton, to me, should be kind of like the worst case scenario for signing a veteran receiver.
Yeah, I think I agree.
All right, next one here. Actually, before we get to the next one, I have to tell you guys about our friends over at Prize Picks. Best and easiest way to consume daily fantasy sports. You've heard this by now several times from us, but it really is the easiest way to get in on the action, get some extra skin in the game. It is super user-friendly. I love getting on there and going into the NBA app right now. It's NBA choices, I should say. It's super easy. Like the rebounds are a cheat code. Whoever you want to pick, rebound it always seems like they're a little lower than they actually end up. So it's a great time to get in on Prize Picks, even though football season has ended. Obviously, there will be some other opportunities to get in on some football action. They're going to have NFL draft choices in there as well. March Madness right around the corner. So Prize Picks, it never stops. It is the best in the business, and we definitely encourage you guys to go check it out. prizepicks.com/guilty, code guilty at checkout. Again, that is prizepicks.com/guilty, code guilty at checkout. All right. We have talked about this guy for so long. That is Mr. Juwan Johnson. Tyler, take it away.
Boy, I'm glad you tweeted about him, so I didn't have to and get the response that I saw. My non-negotiable, which is now going to be somewhat negotiable given the release of
somewhat negotiable.
My somewhat negotiable for the Chargers in free agency this year is to go sign Juwan Johnson. You can say receiving tight end, that's fine. One of at least the 2 premium guys, potentially 3, depending on Mark Andrews. And this does feel polarizing to say a non-negotiable is to sign Juwan Johnson. And boy, based on the comments of your tweet, I guess it is polarizing. But I think Chargers fans, with me saying this and suggesting this and advocating for this, you got to keep 2 things in mind. And that's, what signing Juwan Johnson isn't and what it is. And what it isn't is you're not going to fix the entire offense with Juwan Johnson. You're not bringing in the next George Kittle, Antonio Gates, whatever. Like it's not going to do that for your offense. And it's not the only move that you should make in free agency. And it is not something that should prevent you from taking a tight end in the draft where appropriate. And it's also not an expensive addition, which is kind of where you can switch to like what this would be. Signing Juwan Johnson means you're paying somebody tight end 12 to 14 money, assuming the projections holds. And we'll see it, right? It's not been perfect, but it's usually pretty close. But what it means is you give Justin Herbert a high floor receiving option at tight ends. And it means that you're reuniting Justin Herbert with a receiver that he took under his wings at Oregon, transferring from Penn State, where he worked with Jeff Carpenter on offense. And he took this guy under his wing. I mean, from Juwan Johnson himself, I have a quote here. Going to Oregon, I knew absolutely no one. It was a culture shock. Being there with Justin Herbert really helped me. He took me in. We became good friends. We had a lot of success on the field. And that culminated in the final throw to seal the Rose Bowl to Juwan Johnson. Like that connection is right there. And with that connection, with that relationship, you have the chance to get a tight end who I hope, I would assume, can push further in the NFL with his numbers than he did with Spencer Rattler and Jake Haener. And if you don't believe that's the case, then I think you're kind of admitting you think Herbert's worse than those guys. And to me, I don't believe that's the case. So I do think with appropriate number of targets and, a role in the offense he should have with his contract, I think he can push higher than that. This is a guy also, by the way, who was an undrafted free agent who worked his way into this role, which I think means something. So you get to do that from day one, which is that the case with this draft class? So Juwan Johnson, I have a number on here, 550, but Juwan Johnson had 548 receiving yards last year, which isn't Brock Bowers, rookie numbers or whatever by any means.
Right.
But Juwan Johnson had 548 receiving yards last year. There have only been 7 tight ends in the last 10 draft classes who have had more of their rookie seasons. Think of every tight end you can think of the last 10 draft classes who was drafted. One of them was Mark Andrews, by the way. And only 7 of the guys in the last 10 draft classes have pushed more than Juwan Johnson did last year. Now, sure, can those rookie tight ends go to year 2 and do more than Juwan Johnson's 550? Sure. But right now, in the short term, where they absolutely need to find something, I think Juwan Johnson presents an immediate option that can get more value than even the contract he would get in free agency. And then in this class, you can't count on one of the guys that you really want being there. Because to me, it now feels like the vibes among a lot of Chargers fans, and now is a kind of depends on who that person is. But there's 2 tight ends that you think can push over 550 in year 1, and they should, and I think they will. And they're projected like top 8 players in this class and top 4 weapons in this class. I mean, Burden's got all sorts of questions. People have been moving him to the 2nd round potentially. McMillan, I think, is considered one of those 4 guys, but his range is kind of weird.
Yeah, he's kind of falling too.
Yeah, like Genty feels certain, and then it now just feels like the 2 tight ends, with Loveland being the 2nd one. Some people have him as their tight end 1. That feels certain. Is he even there at 22? I think you walk into this class knowing that you have a solid floor as a receiving tight end. You redo Hurst Disley 2.0, but you do it right this time with a guy who's going to be on the field and can separate and can put up actual numbers and is on the younger side for sure. And ultimately, I have to advocate for Juwan Johnson because, or I guess Evan Ingram, I see you all in the chat. Look, we've been not super hyped on this tight end class.
Yeah.
And we were like, hey, I don't know if this class is it. Might be a little overrated. And you said, yeah, I also think that maybe there are also not a ton of athletic freaks in this class. Boy, did we hear about it. Boy, have we heard about it. And then Harold Fannin turned a sled sideways. And boy, suddenly everybody was like, you know what? Maybe we could wait. And maybe this isn't a great tight end class. I'm not saying that's going to make him a bad tight end by any means.
Yeah.
But I think we're starting to realize that maybe this isn't that class. Then again, even if it was that class, only 7 players in the last 10 draft classes have done more than 550. Just go take care of this. If Ingram is an option for them and they're interested, great. If Mark Andrews is cut, go get him. Sure, maybe at this point, my somewhat negotiable is sign good receiving tight end, but go get one.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it in the draft. And I don't want to sit there and have to take a tight end because you didn't pay Juwan Johnson $9 million. And then you pray that tight end becomes better than what you would have gotten out of Juwan Johnson anyway. So that's my small spiel on that, mostly stemming from me being slightly annoyed at the response to Steven's tweet by some people. Again, remember what this signing isn't as well as what it is. I think everyone saw the advocacy for Juwan Johnson and went, well, they got to do this and that. Like, yes, we get that. There's more to this. There are many slides on this slideshow. Juwan Johnson's just a part of that.
Yeah, Juwan Johnson is a part of that. I don't think, us advocating for Juwan Johnson does not mean that the Chargers can't draft Colston Loveland if he is there at 22. We don't know if he's going to be there. We don't know what his shoulder injury status is right now. He was at the combine in a sling. We don't know if this is the kind of guy who is going to hit the ground running. I think he will. I feel very good, confident in my grade for him. That's very, very high. Tyler Warren, I don't like him, and Tyler Warren's not going to be there, like 100% not going to be there. But Tyler Warren and Juwan Johnson are different enough where those two can coexist. And it's a good thing to have multiple options at tight end. The Chargers last year, their best pass catching tight end was a guy who had never been a pass catching tight end in his career. So if the Chargers had 2 pass catching tight ends and Will Dissly, that's a great tight end room, man. Like this is something that everybody should want. It does not preclude the Chargers from taking a tight end at 22 if one is there. But it does give them flexibility where if one of those tight ends is not there at 22, and let's say, everybody likes Mason Taylor, I will continue to push back that man is not a fit for the Chargers. But hypothetically, let's say Mason Taylor goes 40, and let's say Elijah Arroyo goes 46. There's your 4 tight ends that everybody feels good about. What are we doing in that scenario where Terrence Ferguson or Jalen Conyers is your pass-catching tight end 1? It really is just going to pivot to Will Dissly be pass-catching tight end 1 again. And I don't really feel like I want to repeat that scenario as much as I like watching Will Dissly play football. So Juwan Johnson, it just gives them a lot of flexibility. I don't think he precludes you from taking a tight end at 22. I don't think this is going to change the offense, but this is about adding flexibility and raising the floor of the offense. And Juwan Johnson puts up 540 yards with a horrible quarterback situation. What he can do with Justin Herbert, his former college teammate, I think that can raise to 650, 700 yards maybe. I don't know. So I think this is somebody that makes a ton of sense. I think Evan Ingram is probably a better receiver, but Juwan Johnson has the familiarity. He has the connections, everything like that. And then obviously if Mark Andrews is available, then he's option number 1. But Juwan Johnson, it just makes a lot of sense for where this team needs to go in order to elevate the offense. You have to raise the floor first, and you're not going to raise the floor of the offense by only drafting a tight end and essentially just running back everything else.
Yeah. And that's the other thing. This is kind of it, guys. There really isn't a ton out there. Like if Mark Andrews is available, yes, of course that changes things. Ingram now being available, I think that can change some things. But it is about, with this free agent class and even this draft class, just raising the floor of this offense. I don't know if there's a ton of ceiling raising that's going to be out there for the Chargers. There's no, unless Genty somehow falls, maybe Loveland. I don't think you have this dramatic overhaul of your offense where there's a Jamar Chase walking in, where you can go sign some player who's, incredible. It's not that kind of offseason right now. So it is about addressing the floor of this offense and walking into Houston, having somebody who can, catch the football. Again, 67% contested catch rate, only 2 drops last year. I think he's fine.
Yeah, and LD Brim points out, Benjamin Solak had a great article today on the underrated gems of free agency. He did include Juwan Johnson. And he was a fantastic tight end in play action scheme, and super productive and super efficient in that regard. Great against man coverage, as we have here on the screen. So it fits so cleanly with what the Chargers need at that position, how they want to operate at that position. The Broncos are also potentially interested. They have Juwan Johnson's former play caller and head coach as well. So we'll see what happens there. The Broncos potentially stealing multiple tight ends away from the Chargers this year will be not fun.
Oh, that can't happen. They cannot do that to me. Absolutely not.
Yeah. All right. Our last one here is going to focus on two internal guys, and that is obviously Khalil Mack and Poona Ford, two of the 5 best defensive players on the team. I think this is a non-negotiable that these two players should be brought back. I frankly don't really care what it costs to pay them. Daniel Popper was saying last week that there was a projected number coming out of the combine of $8 million per year. That's cool with me, man. You look at what the other run stuffing defensive tackles are making. I think he's well worth that. We've talked about Khalil Mack a ton. There's just part of running a high quality organization that to me includes bringing back guys who are the heart and soul of your teams. And the way that this coaching staff and front office has talked about Khalil Mack and talked about Poona Ford, how important they are from a leadership standpoint, from a culture standpoint, from a production standpoint. To me, these two guys have to be brought back over the next, 72 hours or whatever it is. I think they're too important for how this team wants to play, for how they want to operate. And frankly, the replacement options, I'm not crazy about. We just spent, 14 minutes, 15 minutes talking about Joey Bosa's release. I'm not crazy about a potential scenario where you're replacing Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa with, a Chase Young and a draft pick. Like I'm not crazy about that scenario out there. And Khalil might choose to leave. He might go ring chasing. He's earned that right. It would be really, really unfortunate. But from a Chargers standpoint, paying your guys, paying the tone setters of your team is just something that other franchises who consider themselves great organizations consistently do every single year. And I think the Chargers are approaching that way. I think the Chargers are a very well-run organization now with Joe Ortiz and Jim Harbaugh. So you have to me, start this new trend of bringing back your guys, prioritizing your players with Khalil Mack and Poona Ford. To me, they are the pillars of the offseason from an internal standpoint. And it's a non-negotiable to me that they are both back in powder blue, regardless of how much it costs.
Yeah, I definitely, obviously, with the Joey Bosa release, feel that way with Khalil Mack. I agree with you on Poona Ford. I do think because this draft class is so insane, I would understand why they didn't bring him back. But to me, it's not about just swapping one for the other. I think it is just building upon the strengths of what you have,
right? /
preparing for the eventually. They're not going to have Khalil Mack. They're not going to have Poona Ford if it's not this year. I think it's within the next couple of years, right? Whatever contract they get with the Chargers, if they return, they're going to have to find a replacement potentially next year, 2 years, whatever. But I think you just continue to build on or next to with these guys. You bring back Poona Ford, awesome. You can still take a guy at 22 or 55 or the whole freaking draft for all that care. You can take 3 defensive tackles, but you start with Poona Ford because you have the foundation for your defense. Yes, you can find an edge rusher potentially at 22, at 55. Great options. You love this edge rusher class, but pair him with and Tuli as well. Like I cannot forget Tuli in this equation, of course, but
for sure,
you can add to that. Keep building on that. And this was very much so. I don't know if the Eagles are lucky that they basically had just nothing but freaks on their defensive lines. It's not a fair comparison.
Sure,
but keep adding to the well. Keep adding to the rotation. And they did that last year. Not as much at defensive tackle, but with edge rusher, they tried to go 1, 2, 3, 4 at edge rusher. And some success, some not so much. But they try to load up there because they value the rotation, not just from the core starting guys, but the next guys in line. So yes, bring back Mack and Ford. And that doesn't take you out of doing anything in the draft. I don't think it changes really much if you bring both those guys back, other than maybe edge rusher at 22 if Mack's not back. but you just add to these guys, keep adding to these players. And again, if you address tight end in free agency, you don't the second round with all that edge rusher talent, that defensive tackle defensive tackle talent that's there at 55, you can go take one of those guys and keep building on what is the strength of your defense.
Yeah, I think that's what it's about for me as well, is continuing to, pour resources into it. You want to be a trench team. I think letting these two players leave is counterintuitive to that point. So I think Puna Ford, you bring him back, and then you can build the rest of your defensive line however you want. But the way that he played last season, to me, it's extremely important that he is brought back. So I'm sure, like, from a front office standpoint, maybe you can look at Tier Tart and the draft class and think, yeah, we can replace 90% of Puna Ford. But what if you don't? What if that rookie does not hit the ground running? And what if Tier Tart is your best defensive lineman? Like, I like Tier Tart. I want him also back. But he's not Puna Ford. He's not that impactful from a film standpoint, from a consistency standpoint. And Tier Tart, we know his history, man. Like, what if it goes back the other way? I don't think it will. I have nothing to believe that it will. But what if it does? What if that rookie doesn't hit? Then your strong defensive line from last year is suddenly a weakness to your team. So I think if you are truly going to be a trench team, you have to bring Puna Ford back. I don't think it's really going to cost you that much. Like, he's not a high-end pass rusher. He's a nose tackle. So he's going to have a limited financial ceiling. And I think he's worth it. Whether that's $8 million, $7 million, whatever the case may be, I think he's worth it to be brought back. And I think it just sets the tone for how you want to operate as an organization going forward.
Yeah, it was the weekly viewing experience wasn't what Justin Herbert throw there was that week. It was always, what's the cool thing Puna Ford's doing, and why is he always chasing down screens? Like, I got to bring that guy back.
As Gabriel points out, Puna Ford and Kenneth Grant, man, that would be a sick duo to see in the middle. And both of those guys can move across the line. So I think it's just it's a group that I think should be brought back.
Yep.
If they lose them, if they feel like they price themselves out, we mentioned Chase Young briefly, but you have Joshua Uche, Azeez Ojulari from the Chiefs and Giants, Carl Lawson from the Cowboys/Jets. I threw him on there because Chad Alexander was obviously with the Jets when they traded for him from the Bengals. So that could be something. BJ Hill from the Bengals, who are letting every good defensive player walk. Jaron Reed, Roy Lopez, Greg Gaines, Folarinzu Fatukasi. Anthony Hopper pointed out there's a few players who were released that I did not hit on this particular slideshow, working on this yesterday. So appreciate Anthony there. Draymond Jones, Raekwon Davis, Javon Hargrave have all been released, would not count against the compensatory pick formula. So there are some options, but Jones, Davis, Hargrave, those are pass rushers, right? Like, they need a tone setting run defensive lineman, and Puna Ford is the best option there for me.
Other thing being brought up quite a bit by a lot of people is Trey Hendrickson not being granted permission to seek a trade and look for trade partners. Thoughts on that as an option here?
I think he's a great player. One of the most productive edge rushers in the league over the last few seasons. I'm a little, again, worried about trading the assets that you need to go get him. The pass rusher trade market has been very, very high. Like, I think there is a pretty good chance that they would have to give up pick 22 for Trey Hendrickson. And then you have to pay him top of the edge market, which Max Crosby just reset.
Yep.
I'm a little hesitant, but I would understand why, again, a trench organization would go out and get a Trey Hendrickson, somebody who's, averaged like 85 pressures and 12 sacks over the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be opposed to it. I am in favor of it. But it is going to cost a lot to go get that man and pay him.
Yeah, as Jacob points out, it would definitely be a sell high. This is a 4-time Pro Bowler the last 4 years in a row, has been one of the most consistent players, productive players on a per play basis, overall stats. He was number 1 over Myles Garrett and Brandon Thorne's true sack rate. Like, if they went after him, I would get it. Is he worth the compensation? Honestly, probably. given how good he's been and consistent he's been. But are you willing to give up that? I don't know.
Yeah. And then Richie brought up, shoot, a couple of comments passed. Oh my gosh. There we go. Okay. Richie brought up Josh Sweat. To me, he's an option, but I think he's going to get a pretty penny in free agency. So if you lose Khalil Mack, I think that kind of pivots to, one of the mid-tier edge rushers and a draft pick. I think that's probably how I would prioritize the edge rusher position. Josh Sweat is on PFF projected to get less money than Khalil Mack. I think that's going to flip. I think Josh Sweat gets 26, 27, 28 million dollars per year potentially as like the top young edge rusher on the market. The Philadelphia Eagles are letting him walk, so that to me shows that he is going to have a massive market in free agency next week.
Yeah, I mean, they just, no offense, but they paid $52 million to Zach Bond. So if they let you walk, you're probably costing them a big contract.
Yeah. And then Ryan Connor also brought up Jonathan Allen, who potentially could get released. That is somebody else that I would be interested from a defensive line standpoint too.
Yeah, that'd be a ton of fun.
All right. Tyler, any final thoughts before we get to some super chats and some questions?
I hope you enjoyed my partially negotiables.
No, I mean, we touched on some good things here. Hopefully you guys enjoy it as well. Should be a really fun week next week. Again, $90 million in cap space. Very different than last year. I don't even think last year we did a free agency stream because we were like, they're not going to sign anybody.
Bill Disley, that was it.
Yeah, so very different from last year. I'm excited to see how Joe Ortiz builds this roster out.
Mm-hmm.
Cash Cab says Drew Dahlman, Falcon center, needs to be ours, top 5. I feel like we've talked about this a lot. I don't really have anything extra to add, but he is a Shanahan type center, and the Chargers do not run a Shanahan type offense. That's the easiest way I can explain it. They might poke around, but if your goal is to try and maximize your free agency signings, getting a player who is a hyper specific type of player and putting him into a different offense is not how you do that. So I'm not anti Drew Dahlman. I do think he's a good player, but I don't think he is a good fit for what Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh have run historically speaking on offense.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't know if there was an additional comment here, but Anthony Navarro said gabagool and then fingers down emoji. So I don't know if we missed something there, but thank you for the super chat.
Thanks, Anthony.
Do you want to touch on any of these other questions? We did get to Evan Ingram a bit ago. So we didn't touch a ton about it, but he had 900 yards 2 years ago. Like I think that he is a legitimate option for pass catching, and I think he would fit. So yeah, I would be interested for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Again, what did I say Hayden Hurst had last year? 39 receiving yards. Like, folks.
Anything else? Anything else? Joe wants to know if we watch Invincible. That episode was crazy today. I do not watch Invincible. Do you?
I'm not caught up. I think I watched the first 2 seasons and then I sort of just drifted. I've seen bits and pieces of recent stuff, but I'm not caught up. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. I have not watched. So everybody says great things about it, but I have not watched.
Yeah.
Jacob says, sup guys, thanks as always. Do you think Slater gets extended before free agency to increase cap even more for this year? What are your thoughts about timing wise for a Rashawn Slater extension?
It's tricky because with Telesco, I would tell you it's a day before training camp starts because it generally seemed to be that was kind of the thing with them. This year, I think it will get done after the draft, and I think it'll be more so about what you can do in season or post draft. I don't think it's going to be something that happens right now.
Yeah, I think this is like an OTAs thing.
Yeah. I think so
the Buccaneers signed Tristan Wirfs to his extension on July 1st. So it was like before training camp. It's going to get done. I don't think Chargers fans should be concerned at all about this extension happening. You you can't call yourself the things that they have called themselves from an offensive line standpoint and then not sign Rashawn Slater to an extension.
No.
They don't need the cap space right now. Like, they already have $90 million in cap space. So essentially you can use that $90 million in cap space, pay your draft class, all that good stuff. And then you sign Rashawn Slater, and lowering his cap hit in 2025 is essentially your in-season budget. So they don't have to sign him ahead of next week. And it's really difficult to use $100 million in cap space in one offseason. Like, the Chargers do have a lot of needs, but there's just not a ton of players that are going to merit like huge contract hits, right? So they don't need the cap space right now. I think they will pay him. I don't think I will. They are going to pay him, but maybe that's like an OTAs thing or before training camp thing. But it's going to get done. It doesn't make any sense to not pay him right now.
Yeah, and there's no, I don't think, any particular rush, because they both, I assume, want the other. Both parties want to work with each other. Yeah, please. Every time I see like, oh, just let Slater walk, I can't do it. Like, I'm just gonna every time that happens, I'm going to play like Phillip Rivers' final season with the Chargers over and over and over again. Granted, he had like no offensive lineman. You don't finally solve the other tackle and then get rid of the tackle that was there. So please, just this will get done.
Yeah, it's going to get done. This is the right time for it. Last offseason, I understood why they would want to wait and see, right? But now you've had the full offseason. You know the kind of value he has to the team. You know what kind of leap he took as a run blocker. He made the Pro Bowl again. And if you wait, you run the risk of him becoming that much more expensive again next year. So there are other players in next year's free agency class who could potentially top him in free agency. And then at that point, you're talking about $33 million to bring him back per year, as opposed to 27 or 28 right now. It's not a huge difference, right? But the Bengals are going through this very thing right now, and they're cutting their entire defense because they didn't extend T. Higgins and Jamar Chase a couple of years ago. So you extend him, it makes too much sense. You can lower the cap at this year. Whereas last year, if you had extended him, it didn't really lower the cap very much. It actually increased the cap from last year. So exactly, Jacob, the Cowboys are doing this exact same thing every single year. They paid Dak Prescott $60 million because they didn't extend him 2 years ago, and they could have paid him 50. So it's going to get done, but it just is kind of probably more of an OTA or training camp thing.
Yep.
All right. Not missing any super chats on my end, so I think we're good there. Okay. Good question from Thomas. What signing or trade would make you hit PF Chang's for dinner?
Bold of you to assume it would take a signing or trade for me to hit PF Chang's for dinner. I rarely go to PF Chang's. I think I've been there once in the last decade, maybe. But look, the one that makes me do handstands, I'll say, is if Myles Garrett ends up being a Charger. That would, I would flip out over that one.
That's fair. I actually had PF Chang's like a month ago. We went.
Nice.
Yeah, it was really, really good. I had some lo mein. It was fantastic.
Nice.
PF Chang's is really good. So there are other like local Asian restaurants we prefer, but PF Chang's is solid for sure. I guess Devontae Adams would be the free agent signing in particular.
Yeah. Yep. Yes, I'm excited for a Lilo and Stitch live action.
I was wondering if you would hit that or not.
Sure. Yes, I am. I didn't realize I needed it until they showed that Super Bowl commercial where he's driving a golf cart, Marshawn Lynch style, and it just makes me laugh. He just makes me laugh. The Stitch is hilarious. Also, obviously, behind me. Yeah,
my little sister was like the same age as Lilo when that movie came out. And my sisters are actually adopted from the Marshallese Islands. So when a movie about a Pacific Islander girl and family came out, they were all aboard it. So we actually called my little sister Katie Lilo for like an entire year because she would wear the Lilo dress like every day at home. So yeah, Lilo and Stitch is it's a fun one in the family for sure.
Yeah, it is.
All right, you guys, that is going to do it for us tonight. Like I mentioned, we're going to tentatively leave our schedules open for next week. We'll see what happens from a free agency standpoint. If Khalil Mack re-signs on Saturday, we'll probably hop on Saturday. So just make sure you turn those notifications on and make sure you're ready for all of the live streams that might be happening over the next week or so. Tyler, any final thoughts before we head out? Did I already ask you that?
Bye.
Oh, nice. Very good. On that note, this has been the Good Teams Charge podcast. We'll see you guys later. As always, Bolt up.